Okay, hi, my name is Christina Cowger, as mentioned, and I'm a small grains pathologist, so I work on diseases of wheat, basically. And I'm real happy to be with you today to talk about mycotoxins and mycotoxin management in wheat. And specifically, of course, organic management of mycotoxins, which, as you'll see, presents some really special challenges, especially talking about this disease called Fusarium head blight, which makes a nasty little toxin called vomitoxin. And really, that's the one I'm going to focus on today. We don't, in the United States and in North Carolina, as a rule, have a steady problem with other kinds of mycotoxins in wheat. There are several other toxins that this fungus called Fusarium makes. But the one we really worry about year in and year out is vomitoxin, with DON. So that's the one I'm going to concentrate on today. So today what we're going to cover is what is this disease that makes a vomitoxin? Well, it's called Fusarium head blight, which is abbreviated FHB, but it's also referred to commonly as head scab or even just scab, so you'll hear me talking about scab mostly. And in the picture here are some heads, and we'll talk more about recognizing these symptoms of bleaching, and particularly the partial bleaching of the wheat heads. When is this disease a problem? What makes a scab year, a bad scab year? Organic management of scab, and what are the special challenges that we have if we're going to do this organically, and then some resources for you as you go forward and tackle this problem, perhaps. Fusarium head blight really crippled farm communities in the upper Midwest in the 1990s, year after year. It was devastating. Scab epidemic in both wheat and barley. Carol Windels, who's an extension pathologist in Minnesota, wrote in the year 2000, it has severely crippled the wheat and barley industries, driven producers to financial ruin and human hardship, and resulted in rural communities literally dwindling away. A lot of people had to sell their land as a result of this disease. So it went on the radar big time for wheat growers, Congress people, and other people in the wheat and barley industries, and there's been a national initiative to combat it ever since. It's not a stranger to North Carolina. Here's a picture from Davie County. May 2009, we had a bad epidemic in 2009. Had a bad one in 2008 in parts of the state. Had a really bad one in 2003. They may be getting a little more frequent. We're not really sure. We don't have quite enough data points yet. But you can sort of see, this picture isn't great, but you can kind of see the frequency of bleached out, ghostly looking heads in this crop that's just a little prior to turning. Susceptible varieties in Davie County lost 40 to 80% of their yield, while right next door in a different field, a resistant variety was only down 5 to 10% in yield. So that gives you a clue that resistance of varieties is one of our biggest defense measures against scab. Same year, Pasquotank County, so you can see we've got widely different parts of the state that were hit that year. Very bad scab epidemic, a lot of these bleached out looking heads in that crop. And back in the Piedmont, Rowan County, this was a variety, Dynagro Oglethorpe, that the grower planted specifically because it was told that it had a great disease package. Well, it didn't have a very good disease package against this one disease that was a huge problem that year, and he took a huge loss on his crop. Now, scab, the fungus that causes scab, is also hosted by several other crops, like corn. It causes gibberella stalk and ear clot in corn. It even attacks carnations. So this fungus is called Fusarium graminearum. And because mycologists are looking for something to do, they gave it another name, which refers to the sexual part of its life cycle. It's actually the same organism. And so we'll talk about Fusarium graminearum mostly. But it has a very wide host range. It goes on wheat, barley, oats, rye, corn, triticale, rice. So it's really an equal opportunity cereal pest. And we got to remember that, because that means that the fungus is hanging out in the debris from any of those crops. And so the pathogens, the disease-causing spores, can come from the residues in any of those crops. So there's a nice corn cob, and see these pinkish patches here? That's the spores of this fungus that are produced in masses. If you look at pieces of corn debris in this state, or most states now, you can often find the reproductive structures, the spores of Fusarium graminearum. So what makes scab severe? Well, it's really rain. Rain, rain, rain. That's the biggest thing. And so just before flowering, during flowering, soon after flowering. We're not talking about rain at any time of the year. We're talking about rain at a specific time point that's just before flowering, during flowering, and after flowering of the small green pod. And I know this is not about barley, but when barley gets into the flowering stage, it's still kind of in the boot, and then it's vulnerable as well. So it's rain around flowering, and also temperature. It can't be too cold. Now, normally we don't have a problem. Fusarium doesn't have a problem in this state, because normally it isn't too cold during the time around flowering. So that one is not so variable, but we can have dry springs and we can have wet springs, and that makes the whole difference as to whether scab's going to be a problem in wheat. So you see these little black dots here, and I know we're not talking about barley, but see the black dots on the barley kernels, and here's a close-up. Well, those are sexual fruiting bodies of this fungus called Parathecia, and they're the ones that produce these spores. These are magnified 400 times. And so that's where the spores are coming from. And the life cycle is, this fungus is hanging out in the debris, in the residue of the corn, or the barley, or the wheat, or the oats. And then if it rains, and that's a big if, the spores will mature in that debris, and they will be ejected forcibly into the air, and breezes or winds will carry them in the boundary layer, and they can spread. So most of that spread is going to be over a short distance, but you can also have a few spores that make it up in the higher atmosphere layers, and they can travel longer distances. So the implication of this is that if you've got residues on the surface, they're going to release most of their spores and get those deposited on wheat heads that are nearby, like this one is pretty nearby. But a few of those are going to make it up higher and go farther, right? So think about that. Debris is really important, but whether you have the debris locally or not is not the whole story. And this also shows the asexual spores, but the primary causes of the blight in the head are going to be these ascospores, these sexual spores that are forcibly released and they go up into the air. So what they land on is the flowering wheat head. And so the wheat head sticks its anthers out, all hopefully, and a spore lands on them, and the anthers are super susceptible. They are the most susceptible structures. Other parts of the head are susceptible as well, but it's particularly at flowering time when these spores land on these structures that we're going to have the highest susceptibility. How long does that wheat head stay susceptible? Well, certainly into late flowering, and particularly if conditions remain moist. Probably also through about watery ripe, which is about 10 days after mid-flowering. And again, it depends on if it has turned out dry or if it's remaining wet. But you have to think about your wheat crop remaining vulnerable after flowering for at least a few days. So the susceptibility starts when you get that rain before flowering. And just to sort of summarize, we're talking about a situation here where the ingredients of susceptibility, ingredients of a scab crisis are you've got debris on the ground, you get rain before wheat flowering, the spores mature and are released right here. And flowering for us here in North Carolina is usually that period from about mid-April through mid-May. So that's when we're worried about the rain. The temperatures are warm. We're not having a freeze, which would tend to inhibit the scab. And we've got susceptible varieties out there that have genetic susceptibility. And then if we get those infections, if those conditions produce, then if you have extended moisture that goes on through rainfill, then those infections in those heads will tend to spread more. And so you get a more severely blighted head. Because the infection will start in one anther, one little spikelet, right, but then it can spread through the head. And you sort of see that here. You see this spikelet here is blighted because you can kind of see it's a little bit whitish or bleached color compared to this one here, which is not blighted. But then this one above it is certainly much less blighted. Here's a blighted one. Here's a less blighted one. So what happened here was a spore landed on this one and blighted it, and a spore landed on that one and blighted it. But this variety of wheat has some resistance to spread it in the head, and so that this one infection here didn't spread all the way through the head. But you can have multiple infections in one head. Now what you see here with this pink color, and that's really diagnostic for this disease, is it's making spores, these asexual spores or conidia, and that's what they look like, highly magnified. They could splash onto an adjacent head or onto an adjacent spikelet and cause another infection. But for the most part, like I say, we're worried about those initial infections from those ascospores. Now, if you were to thresh that head and find out what was inside at harvest time, you'd find a mixture of healthy kernels, nice and plump, and these were called tombstones. These are the blighted, shriveled kernels that are just loaded with mycotoxins. They'll tend to have a little chalky appearance and sometimes a mildly pinkish cast to them. Here's a kind of close-up photo of them. And so that's where we get the losses from scab yield, because we've got these shriveled kernels. Actually, really bad infections will abort kernels altogether. And then slightly less bad infections will give you this tombstone that's loaded with mycotoxin. So either way, that's bad. The test weight of this material is, of course, extremely low. And then usually the percentage of these tombstones that you have in your lot of grain will correlate pretty well with how bad your mycotoxin concentration is in that grain. So again, the mycotoxin that we're mainly concerned about with scab is called vomicotoxin, or DON. It leads to feed refusal and vomiting or emesis in livestock. Pigs are very sensitive to it. People can be sensitive to it too, although hopefully normally we're not ingesting huge loads of vomicotoxin. Causes gushing in deer. The FDA has recommended ceilings for vomicotoxin in our grain supply. We don't have a hard and fast law like they do in Europe, but the recommendation is no more than 1 part per million of vomicotoxin in flour or in bran or germ or other human foods. So that leads to a guideline for grain producers of no more than 2 parts per million of DON in grain that they're buying that's destined for the human food supply. And that's based on experience, which is that usually the milling loss is about 50%, which means usually they're making white flour, and so when they mill off the bran, about 50% of the DON goes away. Because about 50% of that DON is in the bran, the outside of the kernel, on average. Then 5 parts per million is the ceiling for feed for dairy cattle and swine. I said the pigs are a little more sensitive. And then the beef cattle, they say it's okay, 10 parts per million, and also the poultry. Is there a question?
No, I was curious about feeding, like if the mills bought the grain and they ended up at gravity tables so they're using. Do you know if there's any parameter there, say they accept some grain that would they accept grain that would maybe be higher than 2 parts per million if they do their parameter for gravity table with that
The question was, will a mill ever purchase grain that's more than 2 parts per million DON and then clean it? And the answer is yeah, they will. They don't like to do that. It costs them money. But I think most mills in the eastern United States are used to purchasing some lots of DON-laced grain that are higher than 2 parts per million, segregating that, cleaning it, and then blending it. So they'd rather not, and sometimes they'll go out of their way not to source grain locally or from a certain area that they know has high DON So what about DON in organic versus conventional wheat products? Well, what we can say so far is that there's really no evidence that we have more DON on average in organic wheat products. There's no evidence that organic products are more frequently contaminated or more severely contaminated. And I say that on the basis of some studies in Europe, in France and Germany and Italy that compared. They sampled biscuits and bread products and flours and concluded that the evidence was pretty mixed and that the frequency with which they were non-contaminated and also the levels of non-contamination tended to be about the same. Sometimes one was higher, sometimes the other was higher. So, so the good news is that there's no real evidence that organic wheat has got more DON in it than conventional wheat. But any wheat can have too much DON. Yeah. Yes. No-till is a huge contributor. The question was, what about no-till, and is there more DON in wheat that's produced no-till?
Yeah.
And I'll get to that in a minute when I talk about management recommendations. But debris on the surface of the soil is one of the biggest issues. Do you get rid of it, or do you not? And then the other thing to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned, about 50% of that DON is going to be in the bran. And so if you're like me and you actually want the bran, or you want whole wheat flour, then you've got to think about that. And testing needs to take into account that the bran could have particularly high concentrations of the mycotoxins. Managing this disease, what do we do? I would liken it to a full court press in the sense that there's no particular defender, no particular tactic that is going to be the be-all and end-all to get rid of this problem. We're going to have to use a variety of defenses, and we're going to have to be all over the map in terms of our wheat production cycle. It's going to have to be many things that each have a partial effect. There's no silver bullet that will completely get rid of our scab problem. One thing is the debris question that you were just asking about. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another thing, clearly, variety resistance is super important. Staggered planting dates or staggered maturities of wheat. Can anyone think about why would it be helpful to stagger the maturities or the planting dates? Why would it be helpful to stagger when your wheat flowers? Different flowering times. And why would that make a difference? Exactly. Different flowering times. You're hedging your bets. It can't be rainy the whole spring. So hopefully at least one of those varieties will flower during a drier time. Forecasts. We do have some forecasting tools. Scouting your crop. If you're looking bad, adjust the combines. Get rid of more of that DON-filled grain. Seed cleaning. All of these recommendations are discussed in more depth at a website called Scab Smart. So if you don't write this down, just remember Scab Smart. Google it. It's there. It's provided by the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, which is a federally funded USDA project since the great crises of the Great Plains of the 1990s, chaired by people in Kentucky and Minnesota. It's national office at Michigan State. It produces these recommendations based on research-backed data, sort of one-stop shopping for your scab management needs. And then this scab risk forecasting system is available to everyone free of charge, and you can sign up to get alerts. If you go to, oops, I'm sorry, I finally found out how to advance my slides. All right. If you go to this website, you can sign up to get a text message or email alert when the risk forecast changes at the crucial time. So that's all available. I should mention, though, that the recommendations from the initiative assume that fungicide will be a big part of the management strategy. Okay, going over the management tools one at a time. Debris. corn or small grain debris, particularly corn debris, is abundant in our North Carolina landscape. These are standing stalks. Not that one after all. That I had figured out. Okay, so escape right there. Standing corn stalks, totally unincorporated, totally unchopped. If you'll chop them or bush hog them, that will help. That will help them to decay a little bit faster before the wheat goes in behind them. If you'll remove them entirely or bury them, is the obvious way, that will help more. So there is definitely a correlation between how much corn debris is on the surface of the soil and how much risk you're going to have for scab. And as I mentioned before, some spores are going to travel farther. So it's not like you can eliminate the problem entirely by having a clean field, because you could get some spores from your neighbors, but we'll reduce it certainly by some percentage. Okay, variety resistance. And that's probably our best line of defense against a serious scab problem. Chris already highlighted this table, which is at the NCSU Small Grains Production website. And these are the above average yielding fruit varieties. These are all soft red winter wheats, as he mentioned. And I just wanted to point out here, we've got various diseases here, right? And here's head scab over here. Second from the right. There's a moderately resistant variety. MR means moderately resistant. S means susceptible. MS means moderately susceptible. There are only 3 moderately resistant to scab varieties in the above average yielding soft red winter wheats available right now in North Carolina. That's assuming that all of these are actually available when it comes time to buy your seed. And that's also not always true. Sometimes a particular variety can be constricted in supply for whatever reason, locally anyway. So keep in mind, if you're not going to be able to apply a fungicide, you're going to really want to pay a lot of attention to these variety ratings. Next tactic, stagger those planting dates. Most people seem to find this difficult to stagger the planting dates because there's a narrow window. You've got to go out and plant. But staggering the maturities, in this case the heading dates of the varieties, is actually a little bit easier. That one's medium maturing, that one's medium, and that one's late. Okay, not a lot of variation there, right? Which brings me to the point that you're probably going to have to go farther down on that chart into the average yielding varieties if you're going to choose 2 or 3 wheat varieties, and maybe that's not the right number, but let's say you wanted 3 wheat varieties that had different maturities and were moderately resistant to scab. Well, here's some more moderately resistant ones, and look, there's some more variation in the heading dates. We've got an early here, we've got some lates, we've got some mediums. So, and these are good wheat varieties that do well in North Carolina conditions. So I would strongly recommend that you look at both of those columns real carefully. And then, of course, you're not going to ignore these other columns either, because those columns can be important too. And it's important to note that oats may be great on scab, but if you're thinking about it for a field that has a history of soil-borne mosaic virus, don't, because it'll be seriously affected, and that virus hangs out basically forever in the soil. So there are going to be other considerations that will, you'll have to take into account.
In terms of those varieties, do you know if the varieties that are listed that have they been, if they're the soft wheats, they're looking at food or food? Do you know, I know that they're talking to some farmers where they talk to the mill and find out the variety the mill is using. So there's those choices of planting of the varieties that work well for, so is there a crossover with NC State Narrows on that? The market and the variety and that list. Yeah.
So I think the question is, let's see, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. It has to do with how will you'll be able to market your variety.
Yeah, because soft wheat is grown not just, it's grown for the feed market, and there's grown food market and the quality parameters would be different when it may be breeding or whatnot.
Right, so soft food is grown through the feed market and the food market, and those are really different destinations with different criteria attached to them, right? So the vast majority of wheat in this state is grown for either the food market, which would be the name with pastry flour, cookies and crackers, or animal feed. And there is still a very small amount of acreage that's grown for bread flour, as I understand it. Chris may know a little bit more about this than I. Chris, do you want to comment?
Well, my read is that there's nobody breeding for a feed grade, that they only breed to release, and their intention is to be a feed grade. And the farmers, you almost never find a farmer saying, I'm growing this wheat to be feed. They're growing it, and it doesn't make food grade, then it becomes feed grade.
Right.
Okay, yeah. So just to summarize for the web audience, basically the breeding is for food grade wheat, and the intention is to sell it for the higher price that food grade wheat commands. And if they don't make that, then it will get sidetracked into the feed market, which will be a lower price.
Is there any way to visibly calculate a sample, looking over your field, of whether or not you combine it, let it go to head, mature, and the rest of your fields? There's something that you can measure what's on it and cover it up.
Yeah, right. So the question is, how can you tell if you have a serious problem with scab and you shouldn't even bother harvesting it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cleaning it and bagging and all that. I'll get there. That's definitely the track we're on. So, but we're moving kind of chronologically, and here's this risk forecasting tool. So when do we care about that? Well, it's actually aimed at people who are planning to apply a fungicide or a biopesticide. But I will tell you in parentheses that there are no very effective or at least consistently effective biopesticide products for scab control in wheat. And I'm sorry to say that. There's been effort put into developing them, but they work much better in the lab and in the greenhouse still than they do in the field. So this risk forecast is for a time when you could put a fungicide out, and that would be at early flowering or mid-flowering. So what you do is you go to this website at Pennsylvania State University, and that's why the PSU here, and it asks you what state you're interested in. You click on your state, and then it asks you for your assessment date. Well, what it's wanting you to do is click on your current date, your flowering date. You're telling it by clicking on April 29th, and this is the April 29th forecast, that your wheat is at mid-flowering today. And it's going to then take into account the weather for the previous week. That's all these blue days here. It's going to add up the conducive hours of wet and warm, and it's going to tell you what your risk is. Green, low risk. Yellow, medium risk. Red, high risk. Risk of what? Risk of a scab epidemic that's 10% severity or more. 10% of all the little spikelets in your field are scab. And that's just an arbitrary level, but it's a serious level that you don't want. So essentially, you can play around with it. You can give it different flowering dates, and you can kind of let it tell you based on the colors. You can look at your county, what color is it? You can click on your local weather station and get a little more detailed information. But it's going to tell you by the color if you're looking at a bad scab year, likely anyway, a medium risk of scab, or basically a fine year where scab isn't going to be a problem. So that's useful for everybody to know. Because, why? If it's a bad scab year, according to the risk map, then you're more likely to want to go out and scab. This gets to your question about who will you tell anything about how serious your problem is. You can get out and look at your crop. Why? Because you're going to want to know if you need to take further measures to abate your scab levels in the wheat to moderate the amount of dawn and the tombstones, the low weight kernels that you're going to deliver, try to sell, right? That's why. When you want to do it, when your crop is still green, right, before it starts to turn golden. So that's about 3 weeks after mid-flowering, about medium milk stage. You go out, you have a look at the crop, and really what tips you that there's a problem is these kind of two-tone heads that are partly bleached and partly green. So the crop needs to still be green, so you can see the difference between the green color and the bleached color. So that's what you're looking for. You're looking at incidence, which is what percent of these heads have any scab on them. And severity, what is the average amount of scab that that bleached head has? So let me explain that. Incidence, oops, did it again. What percent of heads have any scab? Let's say I have 10 heads here, and maybe 4 of them have any scab, so I've got 40% incidence. Down here, it looks to me like every darn head has some scab, so that's 100% incidence. That would be what percent of my heads have any scab. My severity, what's the average amount or percent of bleaching of a head? Up here, maybe 20%, something like that in these 10 heads. Down here, maybe more like 80, 90% of the whole head is bleached. What good does that do me? Well, I can calculate my index. And my index is basically the incidence times the severity divided by 100. That's kind of confusing. So really what I'm trying to figure out here is what percentage of all these little spikelets are bleached in my crop. And you can get that by calculating the incidence times the severity. Rule of thumb, if 10 or 15% or more of all my little spikelets are bleached, I'm probably going to have a problem with Dawn. Dawn will probably go over 2 parts per million when I try to sell it. I'll probably have test weight problems, and I'll lose some yield. So if you do go over that 10 to 15% threshold, number one, you want to increase the fan speed on the combine. Blow more of that lightweight stuff out the back. So more of these bleached lightweight tombstones are going to be left on the ground, and your grain crop will look hopefully more like that. And you don't want to harvest 2 fields together into the same receptacle, one badly scabbed and the other not. You want to keep the scabby grain separate from the good grain. Why would that be? You're going to sell the good grain. You might try to sell the bad grain too, but you might have to do more to it first. And you don't want to just distribute all that bad grain among your good grain to kind of make it all above threshold, all of it unacceptable. So you might take some further measures with your bad grain. Number one, you might get a Dawn test to find out how bad your problem is. Those are available. You send a sample of your wheat to the NCDA, and they will actually not test it in-house. They will send it to a USDA lab in Toledo, Ohio, and for $40 you'll get a parts per million of Dawn back. So that will give you some information that's probably useful.
To do a little more specific as to I called NCDA, and I could not find out who actually would receive a test. Do you have like who would be the NCDA?
I actually spoke to him the other day. I should have taken more detailed notes. It's in grain grading. Grain grading at NCDA. I can find out exactly who you would contact, and I can get you that information.
Or if that one to do your website. I couldn't find the information anywhere. Just, beyond me knowing before it was out there.
Okay, yeah, the question was, need a specific contact at NCDA. I'll try to find that out and get you that information. But if you call them and say, I want my load of wheat to get tested, my sample, and I understand you have that done at a USDA lab in Ohio, they'll route you to the right person who will, hopefully at least, who will help you. What method do you use? Right, okay. A gentleman said he has an organic grain mill close to Greensboro and he could test people's wheat for them. It's probably an ELISA test or something like that. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's good to know. Yeah, there are kits. I mean, you can go online and purchase a test kit. You know, the question is, do you know how to use it? And do you really want to go through the learning curve of learning how to use it, or do you want to have somebody else use it who knows, who's done it before? All right, the cleaning. So it is possible to clean your wheat and to further improve your grain, to get rid of more of those tombstones, more of that dawn. There are several methods that are commonly used. Screening, airflow, which is aspiration, which is sucking up the lightweight kernels, and then the gravity table here, which is letting the heavier kernels fall through. Is it economical to have your grain clean? Well, this estimate that I'm going to show you costed at about 40 cents a bushel. Could be very economical. Here's this example from North Dakota. So they take a whole field sample, and the dawn is 7 parts per million, so that's high, that's not good. Certainly not if you want to sell it for food, sorry. Test weight of 54. So they separate that into light, medium, and heavy portions, and then screenings, which are the really bad stuff, and have a dawn of 28 parts per million. And you can see that the light, medium, and heavy screenings have different dawn levels, as you would expect. So the bottom line is here, when you pay for this cleaning, assuming that you're paying 40 cents a bushel, on your 1,000 bushels of wheat, you increase your income by $858. And this example goes through the math to just to basically show you how you do that. You can still sell the stuff that's cleaned out, you just get a lower price for it. So there's more information in this publication at North Dakota State University, but the bottom line is that yes, if you have a bad contamination of dawn, it can pay to have it cleaned. Especially if the price of wheat is high, of course. So that's what I had for you today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.